Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to class. We're glad that you're here. Um, got a few announcements before we start. Parkview Singing is this afternoon at 1 p.m. Evangelistic Card Writing Team 3 is this afternoon at 5 p.m. That's the team that Rose and myself are on. 5 o'clock today. Youth Evo this evening following worship services. Sunday Youth Series this Tuesday is going to go to Bryansburg, and the bus leaves at 6 p.m. Wednesday night Summer Series. If you're interested, there are a couple of slots left for folks who can sign up, volunteer to have dinner with the speaker, host the dinner for speaker before service. Bibles for South Africa. We're collecting new or gently used Bibles, and they're put them in room 103. We're going to get those boxed up. Kind of mid-August, we're going to take those down to Nashville. Change for Potter Children's Home. Those cans are due by the end of this month, July 30th. Also, Ladies' Day. They're looking for volunteers to help with each of the committees. There are sign-up sheets on the bulletin board if you'd like to help. So with that, last week we got into some good discussion on singing, and I had a couple questions. Sandy Hart asked a good question. We're going to talk about that just here in a moment. And I had a couple other questions like after class. We're going to talk about those too. I appreciate the comments and the questions, and to me it makes for a good class when we have a discussion and gets everybody thinking about the topic. As we jump into it, last week we talked about the details about singing and how God really laid out a plan for us. He detailed in the Old Testament exactly what He wanted. He detailed for us exactly what He wants. It's not really left to our imagination. He tells us what kind of songs to sing. That list is a list of 3 items, and those 3 items are psalms, spiritual songs, and hymns. It doesn't include that we sing in worship. We don't sing patriotic songs or classic rock songs or country songs. We sing what we're told. We're also wanted to make the point, James 5:13, if anyone among you is suffering, let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praise. We're not restricted to singing only during worship period. Now, it's worship when we're singing here as a group, but if you like to sing while you're in the car or the shower, that's not worship, but you can sing anytime you want, just like you can pray anytime you want. And then also want to make the point there in 1 Corinthians 14:15. What am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will pray with my mind also. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. So we need to think about what we sing. We don't just do it. And yes, we want to be sing praise and happy and with spirit, but we also think about those words and the message. John? John made a great point. Everything that we do, worship is spiritual. Everything we do that's spiritual is not worship. Reverse paraphrase. Okay, we're going to talk about song leaders, but before we get into that, Sandy Hart asked a question last week, and I was having a little trouble hearing. She asked that she had been told by someone that in the dictionary, the definition for psalm, P-S-A-L-M, psalm, included that it was to be sung with musical instruments. She wanted to know how to answer to that. And so I looked through the dictionary, online, you put the Google on it, and I couldn't find any definition that said that. I found that, the Webster definition for a psalm is a sacred song or poem used in worship, especially one of the biblical hymns collected in the book of Psalms. And that was pretty much the standard definition. So I hunted a little harder, and I found where that reference came from. It's from the Encyclopedia Britannica. I don't know about you. When I grew up, we had this big set of Encyclopedia Britannicas in the house, and other people had World Book, but this was long before Google. So if your parents had enough money, you had, I don't know if that's the criteria, but they weren't cheap, and people would get those and have them at home. And your other option was to go to the public library, look up stuff, and now you just whip out your phone, and there you are. You can ask any question you want and have an answer to it just almost directly. And so a phone or the internet can be a great. So if you would turn to Psalm number 4 would be a good. Turn in your Bibles to Psalm number 4. So what the Encyclopedia Britannica says is Psalms. It says a book of the Old Testament composed of sacred songs or of sacred poems meant to be sung. In the Hebrew Bible, Psalms begins the third and last section of the biblical canon known as the writings. Then the next paragraph it says, in the original Hebrew text, the book as a whole was not named, although the titles of many individual psalms contain the word mizmor, M-I-Z-M-O-R, meaning a poem sung to the accompaniment of a stringed instrument. So if you look at the heading of Psalm 4, or Psalm 6, you'll see the heading to Psalm 4 says, the choir master, this is ESV, with stringed instruments, a Psalm of David. And you may find a slightly different wording if you're using like King James. So 7 of the Psalms have that word mizmor, which translated tells us it should be with stringed instruments when it was sung. You'll see that in Psalm 4, Psalm 6, Psalm 55, Psalm 4, 61, 67, and 76. While we're on this for just a moment, I'll make it clear that just because it's Old Testament, so it's not binding in how we sing in the New Testament at all. But that's where that question came from. John, do you have a comment? Right. As John said, the truth of the psalm, the truth of the word, is in the psalm itself, not brought to us by the heading. So the heading is not really binding. Most of the time when folks, if they read Psalm, say Psalm 55, they're going to just start there where it says, give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. But if you back up and look at the heading, it says to the choir master with stringed instruments, a mass skill of David. So that reference about stringed instruments and they would chant these or sing. 7 of the Psalms in the Old Testament mention that they should be sung or with a stringed instrument. That doesn't carry over the New Testament. Now, while I was hunting through here counting these up, turn over there to Psalm 57, just for interest. When you look at these headings, it's interesting because I have never really studied the headings, and I won't claim that I've really studied them yet. But if you want to look at something of interest, Psalm 57, the heading says, to the choir master according to do not destroy, a miktam of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. There's a bunch of them that I guess are sang to the tune of do not destroy, whatever that tune is. It sounds like a heavy metal song. But I was like, what is going on here? Because I was trying to count up how many said to be sang with stringed instruments. And then I saw this phrase, do not destroy. And I'm like, what's that all about? And I can't answer that question. You can study that and figure out what that's about. Then also, I thought it was interesting. Psalm 60 had quite long instructions on it. And then I mentioned last week, flip over to, while you're flipping through the book of Psalms, flip over to 100. And the heading of there says a psalm for giving thanks. But the point I wanted to make was Psalm 100 was a psalm that they sang while we were on mission trip. Down in the islands, they will take this and they will sing it. And it is really good. I mean, it was one of the most enjoyable songs that we did down there that we don't do here. And I'm not a song leader, so I'm not going to attempt to do it. And they add some other little phrases into it, but pretty much it's Psalm 100. So we can sing psalms, and in fact, you'll find some of the songs in the songbook may paraphrase or have pieces of psalms. So the answer to the question is, Encyclopedia Britannica mentions and points out that the titles of some of 7 of the psalms use the word mizmor, which means a poem sung to the accompaniment of a stringed instrument. But that does not authorize us to sing with stringed instruments in our worship. What it was about. So the comment is these headings were added by man, not part of the original scripture. So okay, so the headings, the question was, when were the headings, when did they come along there later on? Sandy? And I'll just say part of what Sandy was talking about was her friend, that they were trying to be accommodating of her friend. To sin for one person, then we should accommodate that and try not to sin. And that's a great attitude to have. In this case, and she went on to say that she feels you need to sing a cappella. I'll be straighter than that. It's not a feeling; it's what we're commanded to do. And so we should sing a cappella in worship. And not add music or add instruments to that. And there are times that we may come across a friend that thinks it's a sin or whatever. In this case, it would be a sin to have that instrumental music. It would it would not be a sin for us if we wanted to sing one of the psalms and we didn't add stringed instruments. That's not a sin to us. I got Bobby and okay, the instructions, the headings Bobby asked about, where's it come from? These don't apply to us. They don't apply to us in that we're not bound in New Testament worship. We are not bound at all by the Old Testament. Be our example. We can learn from it as an example, but we do not worship according to the Old Testament pattern. We don't worship. The Jews worship according to the Old Testament pattern and may do some of that today. I don't believe they do it accurately because they don't do all of the sacrifices and all of that. But we are not bound to worship according to the Old Testament. We're bound according to the New Testament and how it tells us to worship. Have a follow up? Okay, so the question or comment is somewhere along the line, someone has to make the decision of what things we're bound by and what things we're not. And the answer is straightforward. We're bound by New Testament, how the in worship, what the New Testament tells us to do. Again, we can learn from the Old Testament. There were many other laws they had that aren't necessarily a bad idea, but it doesn't mean we're bound by them. It doesn't mean it's a sin if we are not to the standard of the old law. We're not bound by them. Davis. Okay, so Davis asked about what if you go to a political rally and they have hymns that they're singing at the political rally for entertainment, and how can we sing those and use God's name and it not be a problem? And I think the answer is a song at a political rally or a song on the radio isn't worship. Now, if you think it's worship, it's kind of one of those hard things. If you're wanting to sing it and they're playing instrumental music, they got a band or they got it on a tape and it's got music with it, then you don't need to sing with that. You don't need to sing that as worship. Okay, singing outside of worship, I don't see it that we're bound to any standard yes or no about whether there's instrument or music, but it's the rules that we see that we've looked at apply to worship correctly. So a political rally would not, to me, is obviously not worship. If you went to, I'll just expand it. If you went to, say your neighbor asked you, they've come to church with you sometime, and then they go, well, but you come with me, and they say next Sunday, and you go, no, I worship on Sunday. I can't go on Sunday morning because I worship on Sunday. But they say, well, wait, we're going to have a special service on, I don't know, Tuesday. You go, well, that doesn't conflict with with my worship, so I will try to come see. Well, now if they start singing and they're playing instruments and they're singing praise songs and they're doing this as worship, then you don't need to participate. You don't need to sing along with that. It's one thing to witness it, but it's another to, I would say that would be wrong to sing if they think if it's worship songs and praise songs to God, and you might just need to sit there and listen. I got Tony and then I got Sandy. Right. Tony talked to about singing and how um, we're we're specifically told to sing, and there's instrumental music. There's singing, and the two verses are on the screen. We're told to sing and make melody to the Lord with your heart. We're not told to sing and make melody with an instrument. It specifies our heart. And also, I think it's really clear that when you look at this, look down there in Colossians 3:16 near the end of it, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. An instrument can't be thankful. An instrument doesn't think. It doesn't have feelings. It just makes sounds, sometimes noise. So again, it's very specific. It limits what types of songs that we're told to sing, and it also tells us to sing and make melody with our hearts. We're supposed to sing in our hearts. So I got Sandy and then I got Dave. So Sandy makes the example of you go in a store, maybe it's Christmas time, whatever, and they're playing um, music over the sound system that it's a religious type song, and the answer to that is um, shopping in Walmart is not worship. Just not even close. But her point is she's going to in her heart. Um, she's not going to go over to the music section and start playing the keyboard and singing out loud, or that might not work out for you. They throw you out of Walmart, that kind of stuff. But the point is, you're going to be placed. You don't have to leave the store because they're playing music over their sound system. It doesn't mean you got to leave. It's not a sin that. It might be a sin to shop. I'm not sure about that. I'm just poking fun, but um, it's not a sin that you walk into a business and they're playing whatever they're playing on the radio. That's just what they're doing. And if you're going into a place to worship, then you need to think about this. But if you're just going into a store or any other um, public place, and they have, you might go to Four Rivers and listen to a band play, and that's fine. And maybe most of their songs are not religious, but they do, they play an Elvis tune, and he would do gospel music. It doesn't mean you got to leave because Elvis is singing some tune. It's just not. It's entertainment, not worship. I think I got Dave. So David makes the point that many of the Psalms were not written to be sung in a worship service. That's accurate. There were ones that sort of documented where his heart was at. It's more of a prayer at the time. There were ones that they were marching, and it helped them remember God. And that's a good point of that. There's songs in the songbook. If you think back in history, there was a time, probably longer back more than American, but not everyone was literate. Not everyone could read. And so a lot of times singing, um, people could hear the song. It helps remember stuff. But, we'll take the little kids and we'll sing the books of the Bible and helps people memorize things. So songs can have different uses besides outside of worship. And a lot of the Psalms were not written for worship. I think I got Charles and Ron. So Charles makes a good point. Our pattern for worship is patterned after the first century church, and they did not use instrumental music. That came along. We talked about this some last week. 1600 years later, before you had organs, pianos, and that kind of thing. We also talked some about last week. It wasn't that they didn't have access to instruments, because in the Old Testament you have examples of David. Well, God told him to make two trumpets, and he specified exactly what material and how to make them. And they didn't necessarily use those in worship. They used those trumpets, and then they added many other instruments, thousands of instruments, my understanding. But that was all authorized by God through David and through the prophets. We looked at that last week. So they had instrumental worship. They had instruments big time. And then we come along in the New Testament pattern for the first century church with no instruments. These two verses on the screen tell you what we're specify what kind of songs and how we're supposed to do them. Good comment. I've got Mr. Ron. Now, a great point. Basically, well, none of our religious friends are sacrificing animals. They want to do instrumental music, but they don't want to do sacrifice. And Ron pointed out in Colossians chapter 2, around verse 11. In him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. In other words, under the old law, they were circumcised, and then now it's different. But look at verse 13 and 14, which show the old law is done away with. It's nailed to the cross. So this is Colossians 2:13. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your faith, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses. Verse 14. By canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demand. That's the old law. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. So the old law is nailed to the cross. So I think I have Jim. No. Okay, so the question is, if you're listening to the radio and you hear a Christian song that makes you emotional, should you turn it off, or is that worship? I think the answer is, if you think it's worship, if you started singing along and you think you're worshiping, then and it's got instrumental music, or you said you could play guitar before, if you whipped out your guitar and started playing along and singing and thinking you're worshiping, then that's not right. But just because a song on the radio makes you emotional doesn't mean you got to change the station, unless it's like you're driving and it gets too much and you can't see you drive. I would change the station. But no, it's not worship to listen to a song from the radio. I've got okay, so the comment is basically, if you're singing a song, a worship song here with the congregation, and then the building has nothing to do with it. Went out in the parking lot, and I would say for sure you gather up two or more people, then you can sing the song wherever. Nothing to do with the building. You can do it in your home and be worship. If you were to do that with instrumental music outside, then that would be a sin. If you think it's worshiping, if you're singing it to be worship, you don't need to sing it with instrumental. John's had his hand up for So John's comment is part of what's going on here is the Jews who many of the early Christians came from a Jewish background. And human nature is they're going to try to bring along part of what they're used to. And they had instruments, and it just makes a mess when you try to bring Old Testament and here's what we've always done along into the New Testament when it's not authorized. I know that was probably a short paraphrase. I do want to bring up another question before we get going today. I know we got just a few minutes, and the question is, who are the best singers? Think about that for a minute. Who are the best singers? And the reason I bring this up is there's been an issue in some congregations where, and when you think about that, think about it from a human point, think about it God's. We're here to worship God. It's not about us. But from a human point, there are congregations that have said, well, we know, so and so, they went to school and they were in the chorus at school and they're really good. And if we were to put a microphone, people that know how to sing, you wouldn't give me one, okay? Probably wouldn't give him. I don't know. He does better than I do. You know who you are. There's people who know how to sing very well. Would it make the singing sound? That's sort of the same train of thought that gets to the instrument of music. I grew up in a denomination where they had an organ, and the thought was it'll make it sound better. And the answer was no, it does not. It makes the singing, it drowns out the poor singers because they play the organ loud. You don't hear it, but it doesn't make it better. And if you think about who the best singers are, a lot of times it might be some widow that she's up there in age and her voice is kind of past but her heart is in it, and her husband maybe used to be an elder, and she's singing to the song "To Christ Be Loyal and Be True" with all of her heart. Is that what God wants? I think so. I noticed you might have some young person, or I had someone after class last week mention they had a new Christian come in, and they were all excited. This young man, and he's singing loud as he could, and he didn't know how to sing. God happy about how that guy sang? Yeah. And then their example was one of the ladies came up to him and said, people that don't sing so well should sing quiet. I don't think so. And I saw young people, when you're up here for the invitation, sometimes you see young people that are singing out as much as they can, and their heart's in it, and some of them are sitting there with mouth closed and a frown on their face. And I'll finish with one verse, and then I know we've had the bell. 1 Corinthians 14:15. What is it then? I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. Think about just what you sing. Think about who you're singing to, and we will continue. I appreciate the discussion. We still got to talk about song leaders and pitch pipes. We'll do that next week.